Good evening, my dear guests, and welcome to the Rot Report, a weekly gathering dedicated to the strange, the unsettling, and the steadily decaying landscape of horror. Each week, we examined what has surfaced, whether it be films, games, announcements, or controversies unfortunate enough to become public. And occasionally, perhaps something genuinely worth discussing here. Horror has always been an interesting thing. It evolves, it mutates, it survives far longer than expected, much like rot itself. So tonight, we sift through the remains of the weak, the good, the terrible, and maybe even the decisions made by executives who should not be trusted near any franchises. I will, of course, be judging all of it. You may offer your thoughts as well. You may disagree with me, defend poor films, and attempt to justify questionable remakes. Because let's be real, I encourage any chaos that comes my way. So if you would please take your place, compose yourselves, and let us examine what horror has dragged in with us this week. Now, shall we? Of course, I'm Ashcroft, and this is the Rot Reports, where the decay has only just begun. Curry Barker's Obsession has opened to roughly $17.2 million domestically at the box office, which means that audiences collectively looked at supernatural horror romance nightmare fuel and said, yes, opening the weekend to that. Honestly, this rise has been fascinating to watch. Curry Barker went from making YouTube horror content to directing the year's breakout hit in an alarmingly short amount of time. There's something deeply inspiring about that, and also mildly threatening to film schools out there. The premise itself feels engineered to make audiences deeply uncomfortable. A lonely man wishes for a girl to like him, and the wish becomes violently obsessive. A classic reminder that horror always improves dramatically when people stop communicating like adults. Of course, the internet has already begun calling this incel horror, which is both reductive and unfortunately understandable. After all, this film is deeply interested in male entitlement, romantic fixation, and the horrifying consequences of wanton affection without any emotional maturity. Which is, of course, a thriving genre online. But what makes Obsession generally impressive is the budget. The film reportedly cost under $1 million, and now it's opening against studio competition while massively outperforming expectations. This is the kind of success story that keeps independent film alive. I think that audiences are honestly hungry for horror that feels specific, more personal, awkward, slightly dangerous emotionally. Obsession doesn't sound shed into generic studio safety, and people can feel that. Horror has always understood something very important, that desire becomes terrifying remarkably quickly, especially when it's mixed with loneliness and magical wish fulfillment. Historically, that is a disastrous combination. And now, Curry Barker is reportedly wanting to direct a new take on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which could perhaps be the fastest possible escalation from YouTube creator to inheriting Leatherface. Honestly, I'm happy to see independent horror succeed like this because horror remains one of the few genres when strange ideas, uncountable themes, and emotionally unstable people can still become box office hits. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Indy's performances, Nikki, because that is the breakout performance of the year so far. Nikki easily could have become a one-dimensional archetype. The idolized girl, the object of obsession, the fantasy, but Indy plays her like an actual person who's trapped inside someone else's projections, which makes the film significantly more disturbing. She has that very rare quality where the audience understands immediately why Bear is drawn to her, while simultaneously understanding why this situation feels catastrophically unhealthy. Indy's performance walks a very difficult line, warm but distant enough to remain unknowable, compassionate without ever truly belonging to the fantasy that Bear built around her, and that sort of restraint matters. And this has been a genre that has always been an incredible launching point for actors because the genre demands vulnerability while also demanding absolute emotional commitment. And honestly, if the audience is leaving talking about Nikki specifically, that says a tremendous amount about the performance. What makes characters like Nikki so effective is that they reveal the true horror isn't love, it's projection. This idea of a person becoming more important than the reality of who they are. I've seen a lot of people online calling Nikki this emotional center of the film, and that's interesting because psychologically she almost functions as the only real thing in a story built completely around delusion. Not to mention that playing the object of obsession in a horror film honestly seems quite exhausting. I mean, imagine spending an entire production being perceived incorrectly, which admittedly is also pretty much the same as social media. I suspect that this role is going to elevate Indy considerably because breakout horror performances tend to happen when an actor makes the audiences feel something authentic inside something that is so deeply unnatural. Silent Hill F has officially surpassed 2 million units sold worldwide, meaning that psychological suffering continues to perform extremely well commercially. Honestly, this has been one of the most interesting comeback stories in years because for a long time, Silent Hill has felt less like a franchise and more like a ghost that people argued about online, usually quite angrily. What makes Silent Hill F fascinating is that it succeeded by refusing to imitate Silent Hill 2. You have a different setting, a different cultural horror, different emotional focus, and somehow that made it feel more authentically Silent Hill. The move to 1960s Japan was an interesting decision because the series suddenly felt unfamiliar again, and horror desperately needs unfamiliarity. Once fare becomes recognizable, it becomes too manageable. Just appreciate how aggressively unpleasant this game is visually. I mean, you have flowers, decay, organic textures that appear medically threatening, a wonderful atmosphere. But I think audiences responded because Silent Hill F understood something important. Psychological horror works best when the monster feels emotionally personal. Not just dangerous, but revealing. Now, this does mean that Konami has accidentally rediscovered that people enjoy good horror games. Really a groundbreaking revelation, if I do say so myself. Between Silent Hill F surpassing 2 million units and a Silent Hill 2 remake reportedly reaching over 6 million players, I think it's safe to say that this franchise is suddenly alive yet again. Which is fitting. Silent Hill has always been about things turning up when they should have stayed buried. Horror gaming is in an interesting place right now. I mean, players seem increasingly drawn towards slower, more emotionally damaging experiences, which explains the popularity of things like Silent Hill. And I do admire that millions of people are willingly purchasing a game that is fundamentally designed to make them emotionally unwell. It is really a remarkable commitment. But honestly, I'm so thrilled that Silent Hill has survived. Because the genre loses something important when it forgets subtlety, and Silent Hill has always understood exactly how to whisper. In more troubling news, I regret to say that he keeps getting away with this. Uwe Boll is officially returning to zombie cinema with an unofficial sequel to House of the Dead, which he's titled 23 years later, Return to Zombie Island. If I'm being quite honest, it sounds less like a horror film and more like a direct threat towards me personally. Now, for our younger viewers who may be unaware of You, is perhaps the most infamous video game adaptation director ever created by human civilization, and somehow he keeps returning. The original House of the Dead from 2003 currently holds a truly catastrophic reputation. It's this astonishing achievement in cinematic dysfunction. It had editing choices that felt actively hostile, random gameplay footage being inserted into the film, and zombies who somehow were less coordinated than the audience. But I do admit 23 years later does carry this tremendous divorced dad energy for a movie title. And apparently this project exists partly because Paul W.S. Anderson is making the official House of the Dead reboot, and Uwe Boll reacted by saying, "Well, fine, I'll make my own damn zombie island," which I find admittedly quite funny. This has somehow become the Freddy vs. Jason of video game directors, two men who are very much responsible for profoundly chaotic adaptations fighting over zombie rights. To be fair, Boll insists that this new film will rely heavily on practical gore, real blood, and old school effects. Honestly, that part actually sounds quite charming. There's a strange nostalgia when it comes to bad horror films. Not boring films, mind you, but bad films that have a little bit of personality to them. And your Boll movies tend to possess that personality, but it's mostly aggression, mind you, but personality nonetheless. And I guess this film is being crowdfunded, which means that somewhere online there are people who are willingly financing this. You fans remain quite fascinating to me. Several cast members from the 2003 House of the Dead film may also return, which creates the energy of what I would consider to be a deeply cursed reunion special. But I do admire that Uwe Boll continues directing movies with the confidence of a man who's never once read a single review online. It must be a liberating existence. Now, I can't say that this will be any good. History strongly suggests otherwise. But maybe it will be memorable. But who am I kidding? I am sure, just like the rest of you, we are waiting for the porn parody 28 inches later, especially after all the alpha focus later on in the 28 years franchise. Sam Raimi is officially directing the remake of Magic, the 1978 psychological horror film starring Anthony Hopkins and one deeply upsetting ventriloquist dummy. Now, for those unfamiliar with Magic, the original followed a ventriloquist named Corky, whose relationship with his dummy Fats became increasingly unstable, violent, and psychologically catastrophic. As most ventriloquist dummies often tend to do. I'm looking at you, Goosebumps. There's something so timelessly horrifying about puppets. Not dolls, mind you. But puppets specifically. Dolls are haunted. Puppets feel more judgmental. With Sam Raimi directing this feels almost suspiciously perfect because Raimi thrives in spaces where comedy, horror, and psychological collapse begin to bleed together. It's a natural habitat for him. But more importantly, Raimi understands how to make objects feel alive again, whether it's books, hands, trees, Oldsmobiles. Honestly, a ventriloquist dummy seems inevitable at this point for him. Now, the original performance by Anthony Hopkins remains deeply unsettling. Not loud, not theatrical, just gradually deteriorating in front of you. It's excellent psychological horror if you haven't seen it. But remakes have always been dangerous because most studios misunderstand why the old iterations worked. They remake the plot, instead of recreating the feeling. But magic actually makes sense to revisit to me. I mean, modern audiences are deeply familiar with these parasocial attachments, identity fragmentation, and talking to objects online. That material may somehow be even more relevant now than it was back then. And if I'm honest, that is an absolutely vile creation. Kind of face that looks permanently aware of your tax fraud. But I'm pleased that Raimi continues returning to horror, because when he fully embraces his style, there are few directors who balance that level of dread and absurdity any better. Raimi lets the nightmare become playful. And I do admire that humanity keeps creating these horror movies centered around these small, unsettling men with exaggerated facial expressions. It's a genre that, unfortunately, now includes YouTubers. This could generally work, though, because psychological horror succeeds when it makes you question whether the monster is alive or whether loneliness simply gave it the voice. The upcoming Blair Witch Project reboot will reportedly follow a family on a camping trip who begin disappearing one by one after hearing strange noises in the woods. Which means that the Blair Witch franchise has officially returned to people ignoring catastrophic warning signs in forests. A company tradition. Now, say what you will about the movie, but you can't argue that the Blair Witch Project remains one of the most important horror films ever made. Not because of spectacle, but because of implication. It understood something that most modern horror movies occasionally forget, that fear becomes stronger when you cannot fully see it. The family camping setup actually makes sense for this, because camping is already an activity built entirely around pretending discomfort is somehow relaxing for everyone. You have dark woods, no signal, strange noises outside of fabric walls. And humanity, for whatever reason, keeps attempting this voluntarily. Still, rebooting Blair Witch is dangerous because the original worked largely due to the timing. This was when the internet was younger. Found footage still felt believable, and audiences generally questioned whether the footage that they were seeing was real. It was a magical era of online confusion. But in today's landscape, found footage faces a unique problem, because everyone films everything constantly. Modern filmmakers must somehow convince audiences that people trapped in supernatural terror would continue worrying about camera angles. The hearing noises in the woods angle is smart, though, because obviously Blair Witch has always been strongest when it embraces that psychological deterioration. Not monsters charging at the screen, but the slow realization that the force itself feels incredibly wrong. But horror force remain undefeated, because no matter how advanced humanity becomes, we still collectively agree that trees become deeply threatening at nighttime. Interestingly enough, several members of the original Blair Witch team have joined the reboot as executive producers after publicly criticizing years of exclusion from the franchise. And maybe that's actually the smartest decision that Lionsgate has made regarding this series in decades. But I think the problem is that, studios often try to explain too much. Whether it's backstory, mythology, PowerPoint presentations about cursed forests. It's absolutely terrible behavior. But I do appreciate that every Blair Witch film fundamentally begins with someone saying, we should continue walking deeper into the woods, despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. The original succeeded because it understood terror is often anticipation of the unseen, the implied, the feeling that something is nearby and it's patient. So if this reboot remembers that sort of restraint, it could generally work. But the moment someone fully explains the Blair Witch, well, think it's safe to say that the spell would be broken at that point. Maggie Gyllenhaal's The Bride arrives on HBO Max on May 22nd, which means that audiences will soon be able to experience gothic chaos from the safety of their living rooms. Now, The Bride has, how to put this? It's had a fascinating existence. After all, this is part Frankenstein film, part punk romance, part fever dream created in a thunderstorm. And people were very divided on this one. But there's one thing I will say about this movie. It is that I respect the ambition. Maggie Gyllenhaal clearly did not want to make a safe Universal monster movie. She wanted something that was louder, messier, more sexual, and emotionally unstable. And that is exactly how Frankenstein's stories should feel. Jesse Buckley and Christian Bale were also an aggressively compelling pairing. One performer radiating chaotic emotional energy, while the other was looking permanently exhausted by their existence. Now that, honestly, is true gothic romance. But the online reaction to The Bride has been deeply entertaining. One side calling it a disastrous art house monster musical, while the other half called it one of the boldest studio horror films in years. Honestly, either one of those descriptions should make you more interested in this movie. Frankenstein stories remain timeless, though, because they are fundamentally about human arrogance. Creating life, demanding love, and then recoiling from the consequences of both. It's a remarkably consistent human behavior. Now, yes, The Bride underperformed financially, but horror history is filled with films that audiences rejected initially before later becoming cult classics. This is a genre that ages strangely. But streaming may actually help this movie tremendously because audiences at home tend to be a little bit more forgiving towards beautifully unhinged cinema, especially when it's 1 o'clock in the morning, which is the correct time to watch any Frankenstein movie. But I do deeply admire that humanity keeps revisiting the concept of creating life in laboratories, despite centuries of evidence suggesting that this ends badly every single time. But in my case, I would much rather watch a horror film that fails ambitiously than succeeds safely, and The Bride did not play things safely. And speaking of divisive movies of the year, Markiplier's Iron Lung will officially arrive exclusively on YouTube Movies on May 31st. So a film being trapped inside a tiny metal coffin surrounded by an ocean of blood is now coming home to the platform that created Markiplier in the first place. Now, honestly, the success story here is fascinating to me. Iron Lung had grossed over $50 million against a budget of roughly $3 to $4 million. And that is the kind of number that causes studio executives to suddenly pretend that they had always respected YouTube creators. And whatever people think about the movie itself, Markiplier absolutely committed to it. He wrote it, he directed it, he starred in it, and he financed much of it himself. That's a level of creative risk that deserves respect. And I do deeply appreciate the decision to release this on YouTube. Not Netflix, not Amazon, not hidden inside 17 different subscription tiers, just YouTube. It's a beautifully strange full circle moment here. Now, horror has definitely been increasingly interesting because the gatekeepers are weakening. Creators who once made gameplay videos are now competing directly with the studios, and honestly, studios should find that concerning. Now, admittedly, reviews on Iron Lung were divided. Some critics found it claustrophobic, atmospheric, while others described it as a very expensive panic attack in a submarine. Which honestly, that sounds pretty damn accurate when you compare it to the source material. But Iron new restraint. I mean, you barely see anything. The horror comes from implication and your imagination poisoning the silence. And it made for some excellent psychological design. But what fascinates me most is how this represents a shift in the genre itself. For decades, creators needed Hollywood's approval, but now someone can build an audience online, adapt an indie horror game, and suddenly outgrow studio films. The industry is changing before our very eyes. They also admire that millions of people willingly watched a film designed entirely around claustrophobia, isolation, and industrial panic. The fact that humanity continues to seek stress recreationally continues to amaze me. Now, whether you love this film or not, Einstein is important because it proves something. It proves that horror audiences will absolutely support these strange, specific, creator-driven projects when they feel genuine, and that may matter more than the box office itself. Now, for things that were certainly not on my Apocalypse Bingo card, Scooby Doo is officially getting an anime series. Yokoso Scooby Doo will stream exclusively on Tubi, with Matthew Lillard returning as Shaggy and Frank Welker reprising Scooby himself, which means that Scooby Doo has now evolved into full anime mythology. And the premise of this sounds delightfully chaotic. Scooby and Shaggy travel to Japan, accidentally unleash hundreds of mythical monsters, and tee up with Scooby's uncle, a magical girl, and a gadget specialist. AKA, we have officially abandoned realism altogether. Strangely, this makes sense. Scooby Doo has always adapted remarkably well because the core formula to this is eternal. You got masks, monsters, teenagers who are trespassing aggressively. And Matthew Lillard continuing to voice Shaggy is great news to hear, because the man has become spiritually fused with the character himself. It's both beautiful, but also a terrifying commitment to the role. And Frank Welker returning again is legendary. I mean, the man has been involved with Scooby-Doo ever since 1969. At this point, Frank might actually outlive the franchise itself. Anime Scooby-Doo is generally fascinating visually because anime thrives on exaggerated emotions, stylized horror, and dramatic reveals. And if you really think about it, I've described Scooby-Doo surprisingly well already. Now, the online response to this has been deeply entertaining. You have half the audiences saying that this could actually be incredible, while the other half are experiencing full psychological whiplash. And honestly, releasing this on Tubi somehow makes the entire thing feel even stranger. I mean, Tubi has quietly become the cryptid of streaming platforms. I mean, you open it expecting nonsense, and, you could accidentally discover something quite amazing. I mean, that's happened to me, after all. Now, granted, it's only like 1 in a billion, but the chance is there. Much like getting struck by lightning. But what fascinates me most is how immortal Scooby-Doo remains. This franchise survives every era. Classic cartoons, direct-to-video movies, live-action takes, whatever the hell Velma was. Ugh. And now, anime. This is a truly adaptable organism. I deeply admire that every version of Scooby-Doo fundamentally remains a group of people discovering that the true monster is usually some financially motivated old man. It's remarkably educational for children. But I think this series will work well because Scooby-Doo functions best when the creators fully commit to the absurdity instead of apologizing for it. An anime rarely apologizes for anything. The final trailer for Spider-Noir has arrived, and Nicolas Cage is now officially investigating monsters in black and white depression noir, which honestly feels like the role that he was genetically engineered to play. And I figured we might as well watch the trailer before I proceed. So let us do that, because I've not actually watched it yet.
Have you seen it out there? The city's a mess. You used to be.
I know who I used to be. I know who I am now. I'm starting over.
Are you gonna be a dick about it?
Yes, actually, a private dick, to be exact.
My friend disappeared. You're an investigator. Investigate. Are we gonna talk about the fact that her friend turned into some kind of sand monster? Just seems like kind of like a big deal.
What the hell is going on? I can't get into it right now.
All I know is that once it starts, it gets worse fast. Until their sicknesses eat them alive.
Time to show this town who's really in charge. Silvermane's got the city by the throat.
Monsters in the streets! Were you really going to sit there and do nothing?
I was never a hero.
There's still time for you to become one.
You think I want to fight? Look at me. Wrong. Because with no power comes no responsibility. Can't you see that the spider is busy?
Well then, I know what I'm watching after The Boys, which I'm currently rewatching at this point. Now let's be honest with ourselves, shall we? Nicolas Cage playing the weary 1930s detective Spider-Man sounds less like casting and more like prophecy. I mean, he already speaks like a man who discovered forbidden truths in an alleyway. But what interests me most is just how aggressively committed this show appears to be to the noir aesthetic. I mean, you got the rain, the cigarette smoke, existential exhaustion. I mean, finally, Spider-Man for people who need therapy. As we have mentioned in chat, this series will release in both full color and authentic black and white versions. And I respect Nicolas Cage insisting that teenagers should experience monochrome suffering. It's a noble artistic crusade. Now the trailer, as you saw, also teases Man Spider, the kind of thing you should never discover in an alley at 2 a.m. But what makes Spider-Noir fascinating is that he feels fundamentally exhausted. Most Spider-Man stories are about responsibility, but this version feels like it's more about survival and alcoholism. This looks closer to a detective horror thriller than a traditional superhero show. Honestly, that's probably the smartest direction to take. Superhero fatigue disappears remarkably quickly when everything becomes emotionally haunted. Nicolas Cage has also described the character as a spider pretending to be a person. That is simultaneously absurd and one of the most psychologically accurate Spider-Man descriptions ever written. Of course, the supporting cast in this is also surprisingly strong. Brendan Gleeson, Lamont Morris, Lee Jong Lee, everyone in this series looks like they've either committed crime or they're emotionally survived several. Spider-Noir should succeed because it understands style. Modern superhero media often fears sincerity, but noir requires commitment. After all, you cannot half-heartedly brood in a trench coat. But I appreciate that every version of Spider-Man eventually becomes what is a man suffering publicly in different outfits. If anything, the multiverse remains remarkably consistent on that. This may actually become one of the more interesting genre experiments in years, because if it's handled correctly, Spider-Noir could feel less like superhero media and more like a gothic detective nightmare, just with a little bit of webbing. And lastly, Hong-jin has finally returned, and apparently he is returning with a 2-hour and 40-minute alien nightmare. The first trailer for Hope has arrived ahead of its Cannes premiere, and early reactions have described it as a completely unhinged sci-fi horror spectacle. Excellent. So let's take a look at this, shall we? Oh my goodness. I cannot wait for that one. Now, for those unfamiliar with Na Hong-jin, he directed The Chaser, The Yellow Sea, but most importantly, The Wailing, which is one of the most spiritually exhausting horror films ever created. Hope takes place in a remote village near the Korean DMZ, where locals investigating strange animal attacks discover something extraterrestrial. So naturally, everyone's week deteriorates immediately. Now, the trailer itself looks absolutely feral. You have alien attacks, body horror, vehicles crashing through villages, and Michael Fassbender apparently existing inside the film like a deeply concerned cryptid. Early Cannes reactions have been gloriously chaotic. Critics are calling it one of the wildest sci-fi horror films in years. Others appear emotionally overwhelmed by the sheer amount of screaming and destruction. Now, the runtime being 160 minutes, Hong-jin looked at modern attention spans, and you know what he did? He chose violence, and that is a man that I can't respect. Now, what fascinates me most is that the marketing is trying to hide the creatures, mostly. And of course, that is the correct decision here. I mean, horror weakens the moment it becomes fully explainable, especially when aliens are thrown into the mix. Now, this does not appear to be elegant sci-fi. This appears to be people emotionally collapsing while eldritch things destroy the village, which is exactly what we want. Korean genre cinema continues to understand something that Hollywood is often forgetting constantly. Spectacle means more when it's paired with emotional devastation. You need to have both. You need the fear, and you need tragedy. The cast is also absurdly strong. You got Hwan Jong-min, Jun Ho-yeon, Michael Fassbender, Alicia Vikander. This film assembled actors like someone drafting an emotionally unstable Avengers. And apparently, he's already written a sequel. The film is not even released publicly yet, and he's already planning additional psychological damage to us. That's quite remarkable confidence. Now, every alien horror film begins with someone investigating a strange noise instead of immediately relocating. But humanity remains committed to curiosity, especially when it's based upon extinction. Hope sounds exactly like the kind of sci-fi horror that we need more of. It's large, strange, and slightly incomprehensible because the best cosmic horror should leave you feeling smaller afterwards. So, my dear friends, another week of horror draws to a close. We've reviewed the remains, the announcements, the disasters, and the occasionally competent decision. As rare as those might be, horror continues to evolve, sometimes beautifully, sometimes catastrophically, and often through sequels that no one requested, but I digress. Continues to be a resilient genre. And it's comforting it, because no matter how strange our world may become, horror will always find a way to reflect it, sometimes too accurately. So to those of you who joined me tonight, who listened, who argued, who defended the objectively questionable films on display, you of course have my thanks. If you intend to return for the next report, follow ensures that you do not miss the next ascent into cinematic decay, and should you continue supporting our revelry here by subscribing to the channel, I will continue suffering through the news on your behalf. The week ends, but the headlines fade. And of course, all of the rot remains, as it always does. Until next time, fiends, stay observant, and do try not to trust anything that's labeled as a reboot